All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me once again here for another episode of Stvpett Reads Live. We will be continuing this evening. This is the 20th episode of our Christian book series, specifically our 21st episode overall of our Stvpett Reads Live series. We will be continuing with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. This is the 4th episode of that. We will be if you remember, this book is divided into 4 books, and each book has a number of chapters inside it. So tonight we finished the first book last week, which was called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. We finished the 5th and final chapter of that book. And if you'll remember, it was basically where C.S. Lewis was trying to establish that there seems to be a sort of innate natural law or natural decency that we as humans have that does not seem to be based on evolutionary principles, which would suggest the existence of some sort of greater outside force. Now, this is just his particular way of getting to the existence of a God in general. This week in Book 2 we get more into Christianity specifically as we begin Book 2, which is called What Christians Believe. There are also 5 chapters in this book as well. We will be reading chapters 1 and 2 this evening. I'd just like to, before we get into it, I would like to once again preface this, and I know if you've watched the other episodes you heard this already, but I just want to continue to be clear that C.S. Lewis was a product of his time. And what I mean by that is that he had certain prejudices that we today would not consider to be acceptable. These include certain views on homosexuals, as well as views on women's place in society or in the home. These views aren't really very cool, but the point is that I am not one of those people. There is this idea lately, and I'm sure that it's an old idea, but this idea that somehow any single objectionable thing that someone thinks or does or says automatically invalidates everything that they have written or done. I do not hold to that view, especially when we are talking about a historical figure, someone who has lived in a previous time when society was a different society. Society has evolved. Society has gotten better. Society has changed, and we understand and accept as a species, as a society, that those attitudes were wrong and incorrect. But it is difficult to fault someone who lived in a society when that was what was considered to be correct for having those views. So when none of these views, that what he mentions them, make up like an entire chapter or anything. They're kind of offhand comments. I don't really believe in censorship, so I'm not going to not read them. I will read them when we come to them. I'm not going to gloss over these objectionable views. Just when we do come to them, I will discuss them afterwards, and we'll have a brief talk about them. So I think that basically covers that. And if you wonder why I keep saying it, it's in case you haven't watched one of the previous episodes. And the second reason is because while I remember them being in here, it's been a while since I've read this book in its entirety, and so I do not remember the specific places in the book. So it could be that some of these comments come in this week's, and it could be that we won't hear about them for another 6 or 7 episodes. I don't know. So anyway, so we're going to get into that in just a moment. As you know, we've been starting each episode with a poem. We have mainly been doing poems from this book here, which I'm going to put on screen now, called Reflections, Poems of Communion by Bethany Roberts. And if you did enjoy any of those particular poems, let me know in chat and I'll send you a link to her Instagram, and you can contact her to get a copy of that book. That is not, however, what we're going to be reading tonight. I'm going to kind of go with one of C.S. Lewis's sort of not exactly contemporaries, another famous author and poet named Rudyard Kipling. I mean, they had some overlap. C.S. Lewis was a bit younger than Kipling, about 30 years younger than Kipling, but there definitely was about a 30-year period where they were contemporaries. And perhaps this poem that I'm going to read may even be something that C.S. Lewis himself would have read growing up. I'm not sure of exactly what year it was published, but this is by Rudyard Kipling. It's a very famous poem called If. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build 'em up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. So that was the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Rudyard Kipling, of course, was also famous for the Jungle Book, among other things. So let's get right into our book now this evening. So again, we are beginning Book 2, What Christians Believe, and the first chapter is called The Rival Conceptions of God. I have been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I am going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all those religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question, that mattered to them the most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there can only be one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority. Lines up with the ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. Now I go on to the next big division. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. There are two very different ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that He is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. It all depends on your point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitively good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God to be beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel, and as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body, that the universe almost is God, so that if it did not exist, He would not exist either. And anything you find in the universe is a part of God. The Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture, and he does not die if his picture is destroyed. You may say he's put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean that all its beauty and interest has come out of his head. His skill is not in the picture in the same way that it is in his head or even in his hands. And I expect you see how this difference between pantheists and Christians hangs together with the other one. If you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world, and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to His will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, don't talk damned nonsense. For Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of His head, as a man makes up a story. but it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists and insists very loudly on our putting them right again. And of course that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling, whatever you say and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water, because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed as well, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely, my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know that it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. The second chapter of Book 2 we start now is called The Invasion. Very well then. Atheism is too simple, and I will tell you another view that is also too simple. It is the view I call Christianity and water. The view which simply says there is a good God in heaven and everything is all right, leaving out all the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and the redemption. Both these are boys' philosophies. It is no good asking for a simple religion. After all, real things are not simple. They look simple, but they are not. The table I am sitting at looks simple, but ask a scientist to tell you what it is really made of. All about the atoms, and how the light waves rebound from them and hit my eye, and what they do to the optic nerve, and what it does to my brain, and of course you will find that what we call seeing a table lands you in mysteries and complications which you can hardly get to the end of. A child saying a child's prayer looks simple, and if you are content to stop there, well and good. But if you are not, and the modern world usually is not, if you want to go on and ask what is really happening, then you must be prepared for something difficult. If we ask for something more than simplicity, it is silly then to complain that the something more is not simple. Very often, however, this silly procedure is adopted by people who are not silly, but who consciously or unconsciously want to destroy Christianity. Such people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and make that the object of their attack. When you try to explain the Christian doctrine as it is really held by an instructed adult, they then complain that you are making their heads turn round and that it is all too complicated, and that if there really were a God, they are sure he would have made religion simple, because simplicity is so beautiful, etc. You must be on your guard against these people, for they will change their ground every minute and only waste your time. Notice, too, their idea of God making religion simple, as if religion were something God invented, and not his statement to us of certain quite unalterable facts about his own nature. Besides being complicated, reality, in my experience, is usually odd. It is not neat. It is not obvious, not what you expect. For instance, when you have grasped that the Earth and the other planets all go around the sun, you would naturally expect that all the planets were made to match, all at equal distances from each other, say, or distances that regularly increased, or all the same size, or else getting bigger or smaller as you go further from the sun. In fact, you find no rhyme or reason that we can see about either the sizes or the distances, and some of them have one moon. One has 4, one has 2, some have none, and one has a ring. Reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons I believe Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. So let us leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these over-simple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. What is the problem? A universe that contains much that is obviously bad and apparently meaningless, but containing creatures like ourselves who know that it is bad and meaningless. There are only 2 views that face all the facts. One is the Christian view, that this is a good world that has gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what it ought to have been. The other is the view called dualism. Dualism means the belief that there are 2 equal and independent powers at the back of everything, one of them good and the other bad, and that this universe is the battlefield in which they fight out an endless war. I personally think that next to Christianity, dualism is the manliest and most sensible creed on the market, but it has a catch in it. The 2 powers, or spirits, or gods, the good one and the bad one, are supposed to be quite independent. They both existed from all eternity. Neither of them made the other. Neither of them has any more rights than the other to call itself God. Each presumably thinks it is good and thinks the other is bad. One of them likes hatred and cruelty, the other likes love and mercy, and each backs its own view. Now what do we mean when we call one of them the good power and the other the bad power? Either we are merely saying that we happen to prefer one to the other, like preferring beer to cider, or else we are saying that whatever the 2 powers think about it, and whichever we humans at the moment happen to like, one of them is actually wrong, actually mistaken, it regarding itself as good. Now, if we mean merely that we happen to prefer the first, then we must give up talking about good and evil at all. For good means what you ought to prefer, quite regardless of what you happen to like at any given moment. If being good meant simply joining the side you happen to fancy for no real reason, then good would not deserve to be called good. So we must mean that one of the 2 powers is actually wrong and the other is actually right. But the moment you say that, you are putting into the universe a 3rd thing in addition to the 2 powers. You are putting some law or standard or rule of good which one of the powers conforms to and the other fails to conform to. But since the 2 powers are judged by this standard, then this standard, or the being who made this standard, is farther back and higher up than either of them, and he will be the real God. In fact, what we meant by calling them good and bad turns out to be that one of them is in a right relation to the real ultimate God, and the other in a wrong relation to him. The same point can be made in a different way. If dualism is true, then the bad power must be a being who likes badness for its own sake. But in reality, we have no experience of anyone liking badness just because it is bad. The nearest we get into is cruelty. But in real life, people are cruel for one of two reasons. Either because they are sadists, that is, because they have a sexual perversion, which makes cruelty a cause of sensual pleasure to them, or else for the sake of something that they are going to get out of it, money or power or safety. But pleasure, money, power, and safety are all, as far as they go, good things. The badness consists in pursuing them by the wrong method, or in the wrong way, or too much. I do not mean, of course, that the people who do this are not desperately wicked. I do mean that wickedness, when you examine it, turns out to be the pursuit of some good in the wrong way. You can be good for the mere sake of goodness. You cannot be bad for the mere sake of badness. You can do a kind action when you are not feeling kind, and when it gives you no pleasure, simply because kindness is right. But no one ever did a cruel action simply because cruelty is wrong, only because cruelty was pleasant or useful to him. In other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness. And there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. We call sadism a sexual perversion, but you must first have the idea of normal sexuality before you can talk of its being perverted. And you can see which is the perversion, because you can explain the perverted from the normal, and cannot explain the normal from the perverted. It follows that this bad power, who is supposed to be on equal footing with the good power, and to love badness in the same way as the good power loves goodness, is a mere bogey. In order to be bad, he must have good things to want, and then to pursue in the wrong way. He must have impulses which were originally good in order to be able to pervert them. But if he is bad, he cannot supply himself either with good things to desire or with good impulses to pervert. He must be getting both from the good power, and if so, then he is not independent. He is part of the good power's world. He has been made either by the good power or by some power above them both. Put it more simply still. To be bad, he must exist and have intelligence and will, but existence, intelligence, and will are in themselves good. Therefore he must be getting them from the good power. Even to be bad, he must borrow or steal from his opponent. And do you now begin to see why Christianity has always said that the devil is a fallen angel? That is not a mere story for the children. It is a real recognition of the fact that evil is a parasite, not an original thing. The powers which enable evil to carry on are powers given it by goodness. All the things which enable a bad man to be effectively bad are in themselves good things: resolution, cleverness, good looks, existence itself. That is why dualism in a strict sense will not work. But I freely admit that real Christianity, as distinct from Christianity in water, goes much nearer to dualism than people think. One of the things that surprised me when I first read the New Testament seriously was that it talked so much about a dark power in the universe, a mighty evil spirit who was held to be the power behind death and disease and sin. The difference is that Christianity thinks this dark power was created by God, and was good when he was created, and went wrong. Christianity agrees with dualism that this universe is at war, but it does not think this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it is a civil war, a rebellion, and that we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you are really listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going. He does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean at this time of day to reintroduce our old friend the devil, hoofs and horns and all? Well, what the time of day has to do with it I do not know, and I'm not particular about the hoofs and the horns. But in other respects my answer is yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry, if you really want to, you will. Whether you'll like it when you do is another question. So that is the end of our second chapter. That's the end of our reading for today. So I'm going to give a moment here, see if anyone wants to comment, and then I'll kind of dig in and we'll talk about it. Now, there's a lot of getting into the weeds sort of stuff here, a lot of stuff about philosophy. I'm not going to necessarily agree or back up his specific views of other religions exactly, as, they may be tainted by prejudice, and if I don't know better. In case you were unclear, the Mohammedans he's referring to is what we would today call Muslims. Mohammedans was just one of the possible terms that was used at the time. So what he's saying about dualism, and I want to just kind of break a few things down here on dualism. So what he's trying to say is that, no one wakes up. It's the way he explains it's a little difficult to grasp. But I think what he's trying to say is that no one wakes up in the morning and says, today I'm going to go out and be evil. Essentially speaking, the evil doesn't necessarily believe themselves to be evil. They may have goals that are in themselves perfectly good goals, but the things they do to get those goals, whether they have justified it through a ends justify the means sort of thing, or whether their view of the world is just so corrupted as to allow them to believe some truly questionable things. So I'm going to give some examples here that are very difficult, very, very difficult. So the point he's trying to make is that, yes, there are people out there who are truly horrible, cruel people. And I mean, when he's talking about sadists, it's and sexual perversions, I'm pretty sure he's not really talking about, an average person at home wanting to do a little BDSM or something, with a leather flogger and a ball gag or whatever. I'm pretty sure he's talking about the type of people who might end up as serial killers or things of that nature, or sometimes the people who actually carried out torture on the behalf of various despotic regimes in our world history. Some of those people, it is noted, got some sort of pleasure, or whether that's sexual or not is questionable, but some sort of pleasure out of inflicting this extreme pain and death upon other people. And I believe that is what C.S. Lewis is talking about here. Now, what he's trying to say is that pleasure in and of itself, wanting to feel pleasure, is not bad. It is not evil. Pleasure is not evil. But the way that some people get there is. Again, you may have, and this is going to touch on some pretty icky subjects, so please bear with me. You may have something like eugenics. Now, let's be clear. Our modern view is that eugenics is obviously unacceptable. It's in many cases racist, and if it's not racist, if the race is not the basis of the eugenics, it's at the very least highly prejudiced against various people of varying levels of mental and physical ability, kind of suggesting that they need to be weeded out in some way. Generally speaking, the view that we look at today is that eugenics is evil. But what is the purpose of eugenics? What was the purpose of the people who believed in eugenics? It was to better the human race, to make us stronger and smarter and faster. Now, I would argue that, what they did was wrong, and when they exercised it in real time, you have on the minor end, and I don't mean minor as in it's a minor thing, but it's minor in comparison to what some people did. On the minor end, you have some of the eugenics programs that occurred here in the United States, where people who were seen as being, for lack of a better term, undesirable, either through reasons of race or mental disability or poverty, were essentially forcibly sterilized by the state. And obviously that is a major thing. It is wrong, it is evil, and we would accept that. But there, at the major end, of course, you have someone like the Nazis, who did unspeakable and horrible things to eliminate whole sections of society. Their desire to completely eliminate not only Jews, but also gypsies or Roma as travelers. There's a couple different terms for them. And homosexuals, and again, mentally and physically disabled people as part of the eugenics ideal. And this is completely wrong. It is evil. It is a sin. I can't say that in any clearer terms. But the point is that these people, while their beliefs we can see to be wrong, the reason they were able to believe that they were correct is because their end goal, they believed, was good, which was the betterment of humankind. Unfortunately, some other prejudices and beliefs about what that meant got in there and corrupted it, and resulted in what we call eugenics, which is a terrible, terrible evil. But the point C.S. Lewis tries to make here, and that I've just tried to make, is that those people did not wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to go out today and be evil. I'm going to go out and sterilize people just because I'm evil. That's not quite the way it works. They believed that what they were doing was right and good. Now, they were wrong. I can't stress enough that they were wrong. But his only point here is this idea that, no one, no matter what they do, wakes up believing that they're evil and I'm going to go out and commit evil things. There is this kind of basis, and that's just his proof against dualism, because the idea is that if there was an equal entity to God that was what we would call bad or evil, then we have a problem, because all these things that we know to be bad and evil and wrong would in some way be endorsed or justified by another power. So I'd like to briefly go back to the first of the two chapters. So I kind of went into the kind of deep, messy stuff. So let's go back a little bit to the first of the two chapters, be a little lighter. And when he was talking about pantheism, the idea that the entire universe is God. Now we're getting into some pretty kind of, almost some people might suggest, splitting hairs philosophy here. So generally the Christian belief is that God is in all and through all. He is omnipresent. He is everywhere. He is in me. He is in you. He is in the tree. He is in the rock. He is in the bird. He is everywhere. But that is not necessarily the same thing as saying that God and the universe are synonymous. He makes a very good point there, which is kind of a difficult one to think about, which is the fact that if God and the universe are synonymous, then he can't really be the creator, because not that there would necessarily be a creator in that sense, but the point is, if he is a creator, then the universe can't exactly be the same thing. That's not quite the way it works, at least not to our mind. But it's an interesting. It is a very interesting thing. I have heard people say that things that are like that God is kind of beyond our understanding, and that our conceptions of just and unjust, right and wrong, are to some extent not applying to him. I've heard Christians say things like that. Specifically in response to when I would speak with something like, my personal belief that God would not want us to throw out people who are homosexual or transgender, that he would not want us to discriminate against them, because I believe that God is love. That's my belief. And that he commands us to love others regardless of who and what they are. And what I've often heard back from other Christians who do believe that people should be against gay marriage on the basis of Christianity, is this idea that, just because you cannot conceive of a just God being right and wrong, your problem is thinking that there is a just God or whatever. And I think, the problem with that is that puts, I think that's almost antithetical to Christianity. If God is not love, if God is not just, why would he send his son to save us? Why? If he is not love. So that is just a few thoughts. That is the main point of this book, Mere Christianity, is that yes, it gives some information. C.S. Lewis is essentially in this book trying to tell us about his own personal journey from atheism to Christianity, and if we're being honest, specifically the Anglican version of Christianity, although he has said that this is really just about Christianity in general. So that's why this is often referred to as what's called Christian apologetics. Now, that does not mean apologize in the sense of make excuses for or be sorry about or anything like that. Apologetics in this particular sense means, trying to justify Christianity to an atheist, to explain why Christianity or any other religion is logical. That's essentially what apologetics means. So this is admittedly sometimes the stuff he digs into here, you're really getting into the weeds of philosophical thought. But I think it's a good book that leaves the reader with a lot of things to think about. If you are Christian, they're just interesting things to think about that, while thinking about them may help you to better come to what I believe ultimately all Christians have to do. I believe that all Christians ultimately must come to their own personal understanding of Christianity. The church can say a specific thing, any denomination can say a specific thing, but in the end, we have to internalize that. We have to come to our own understanding, and sometimes that means you end up switching denominations. Sometimes it may mean you stop going to church or something like that, but you have to come to your own understanding. And that's why I think that this is an excellent book, because it really gives you a lot of things to think about as a Christian, to help you come to your own understanding. And if you're not a Christian, it gives you a pretty good reason of why C.S. Lewis, who's a fairly impressive author and thinker, believed. Because you might think, well, why would an educated person believe in something like Christianity that to some people might seem like, hokum and fairy tales? And he's laying it out for you. He's laying out the logical course that he took. Now, in the end, you may not agree with it, and that is fine. But hopefully you've all gotten something out of it, whether you are Christian or not Christian. If you are not Christian, not a Christian, coming from outside of the Christian faith, and would like to know more either about the Christian faith or about Anglicanism, Episcopalianism in particular, you will find a link in the description of my video on YouTube, linking to the beliefs page of the Episcopal Church. If you are already a Christian or are looking for an Episcopal Church near you, you will also be able to find a link to the Episcopal Asset Map, which has all the Episcopal churches in the country on it. So that is the end of our episode today. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I really do encourage, I can see that there's a couple of people watching, but I really do encourage next week, maybe if some of you could comment, we could have more of a discussion. Now, I'm happy to give you my thoughts such as they are, but I think that these episodes would be much improved by more of a sort of discussion. So please consider, giving your comments. Other than that, I'll just mention, so our next episode will be this Saturday, which I believe is October the 3rd. Let me double check that. Yes, October the 3rd. So that will be our next episode. We will be continuing with Book 2, and we will be doing chapters 3 and 4 of that book. The first is called The Shocking Alternative, and the second is The Perfect Penitent. And, I'm looking here. We might just go ahead and do 2, 3, 4, and 5, because they're not really that long. I don't know. I'll think about it. We'll at least be doing chapter 3 and 4 and possibly chapter 5 to wrap up book 2 in this as we read Mere Christianity. Also, the Stvpett Reads horror series. I apologize for this last weekend not getting it up. To make up for that, we will actually be having 2 episodes this weekend. One at 10 p.m. on Saturday, and one going up at 10 p.m. on Sunday. So if you have missed any of those, if you'll give me a second, I will go ahead and post into the chat a link to the playlist for those. So just in case you haven't seen that yet, those are not live episodes. They are similar in structure to this, in that they are essentially a reading followed by a sort of discussion period, but the discussion in that case is just me kind of doing an analysis, or sometimes talking about the history of or the life of the writer of the horror stories, which is kind of a little fun sort of thing. I'm going to put this in here. So there is a link in the chat now to the playlist of the Stvpett Reads horror episodes. So hopefully you will join me at 10 p.m. Like I said, they are not live in any real sense. I'm not talking directly into the camera and live at those points. They are pre-recorded, but I will be in the chat live. So if you do have any comments or want to say anything during those episodes, I will be there to see your chat. So thank you all for joining me, and all of you have a great evening, and I hope to see some of you on Saturday. Thank you. Have a good evening.